वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह Vaji Khalsa, Vaji Fateh ji. Welcome to Khoj Gurbani for another session. This is Ravinder Singh from Columbus. And it seems like I'm losing my voice a little bit, but we'll see what happens. Tonight, it's my distinct privilege to be sharing thoughts about Hukam. I was kind of reflecting over this and said to myself, I mean, it's quite foolhardy to try and talk about something that is indescribable. But here we are. I've done rash things before. So hopefully you have the slides. Harvinder, can you give us the first slide?
GVG, I'm sharing on screen. Can you see it?
I can't, but if everybody else can, that's fine. Okay, so the first slide that I have is titled Hukam Accessing the Quantum Mind. And that is really the approach that I want to take, is to view Hukam from that perspective. What I really mean by that is that I feel that Gurbani needs to be interpreted, reinterpreted over and over again by successive generations in the light of the current knowledge and understanding. So, you know, what was okay 500 years ago, that interpretation may not make sense to us. Gurbani is still the same, but we are all coming at it from our own subjective experiences. So I think the lingua franca today is we live in an environment that is very taken up with a scientific temperament, if you will, and so it's not something we can ignore. But I think something that we should address. So what I have out here are quotations from two of my my all-time favorite people. The one on the top is from Mysticism and Logic by Bertrand Russell. For those of you who are not familiar with him, he was a British philosopher and mathematician, a mathematician actually, analytic logic, and also won the Nobel Prize for literature, no less, because he wrote it just an absolute stunning style. So what he has up here, and the other one, of course, is our good old man Baba Nanak, who is certainly my all-time favorite. The reason I have these two quotes up here is I just wanted to contrast the despair that you can, and I'm going to read this, the despair in Bertrand Russell's description of his world, which is no doubt a gift of the Enlightenment and the separation of mind and matter, where he's saying that, you know, at the end of the day, all of human genius is destined to be extinct in the vast death of the solar system. And he wonders how in such an alien and inhuman world can so powerless creature as man preserve his aspirations untarnished. On the other hand, we have Guru Nanak telling us to walk in Hukam and reminding us that Man tu jot sarup hai, apna mool pachan. So I just thought that this was a real contrast between the two viewpoints. But before we go on, just a little bit of, I suppose, context is necessary. So, you know, the quote from Guru Nanak is basically saying, "Kiv sachiara hoye, kiv kure tute pal." This is the foundational question which he poses at the very outset of Gurbani. And the question really is a very perennial one. It's as modern as it is, you know, traditional. And all individuals have been afflicted by this kind of existential angst. And Satyar, by the way, has also been denoted in Gurbani with terms like Panch, Brahmgyani, Gurmukh, which essentially points to an ideal man or person. So he's asking, Kiv Satyara hoye. Satyara, of course, literally means one who wears or adorns the truth. So by posing this question early on, what Guru Nanak in effect is reminding us is that at the end of the day, there is only one meaningful question to ask. And that is the question that should demand our attention. And what that implies is that there is a way of living, a way of life that is worthy of living, and another that is perhaps not so worthy of living. So our central responsibility as humans is to be able to fashion that life. So before we can fashion that life, we need to understand, how does one achieve such a lifestyle, or how does one become a satyar? So Guru Nanak's answer to that question is that we become satyars by attuning our lives to hukam of the razai rather. Hukam razai chalana nanak likhya naam. So then the question is, what is this hukam, and who is this razai, whose hukam that we have to follow? Uh, and I have here, for the sake of conversation, said, hukam can be thought of as, it's a term of Persian Arabic origins. It can mean order, as in a command, or order as in the natural order, a writ, a decree, or will. So just so that we can have a conversation, I've used will of God. And what he's telling us, that hukam, will of God, permeates all creation, and by extension is inscribed in all of us as well. So the trick here is to access that will, which is seated or scripted in the depths of our own being. So the question then becomes, okay, very well, how does one do this? Or in other words, what is it that prevents us from lining up with this hukam that is inscribed in us? And what Guruji is saying is, well, there is a kurdi pal, or literally translated into English, a wall of falsehood. Okay, and not a very appropriate translation, but it'll do for our conversation. You all, I think, quite get the drift of what I'm saying. In other words, what he's saying is that there is an illusion, or a distortion, if you will, that is preventing us from aligning or lining up with hukam. And by the way, he also tells us that this illusion, it turns out, is really us. So we are really the illusion. We are standing in our own way. So that basically is the background to hukam. So hukam, he goes on to tell us, creates all life. It's been brought forth by hukam, and it governs our moral and ethical worlds. Hukam determines the cause and effect of our actions. It is responsible for distinctions in rank, achievement, sorrow, and happiness, just about everything. So the way I would sort of summarize it in my own terms is that hukam can be thought of as perhaps the creative or a regulatory framework for a concur, and functions at all levels of existence. So in the terms of today, we could say that it is the creative impulse that drives evolution, that regulates the natural order, that establishes the moral and ethical framework that we live in, and exists in us also as the sense of self, as home. It also exists in self. And so I see this as God expressing himself in time and history. He's nirgun, but he's sargun as well in history. So, and even though hukam, he tells us keha na jaye, here again, it's an interesting thing to say that hukam, we've often translated this to mean hukam keha na jaye, to mean that it can't be described, but perhaps it also means that it is not something that is spoken in the manner that we speak to each other. Perhaps there is another way that hukam speaks to us, and that is what I want to talk about a little today, because it seems to me what this is suggesting is that there is embedded in us another knowing or understanding, another set of faculties that surpass just intellect. And it is to these faculties that we have to turn in order to understand and collaborate with hukam. And it is these faculties that I call sort of quantum. Not being much of a physicist, nonetheless, I think quantum physics has given layperson like us the terminology to be able to at least converse and have a more meaningful conversion. So let's examine what this creative process called hukam really is, just to settle some more context. And I'll do this a little in the sort of with quantum physics in mind, and at least what I have understood of it. Uh, Harvinder, next slide, please, and just let me know when you're there.
Uh, we are
Are you
on.
there?
Yeah, I am here. So which slide we want number?
It's called the creative process.
Okay, got it.
You got that, right?
Yes.
Okay, so now I apologize. I didn't quite, I'm not making excuses here, but I was pressed for time and I just kind of, this morning I was saying, how do I'd like to illustrate the process rather than talk too much about it, because to me, visuals, are easier to explain. So what I did was I hope you can see a little, at least visualize this a little bit. I'll walk you through this in the next couple of minutes. So I relied very heavily to illustrate this on a Shabad of Guru Nanak's in Malar. And it is a Shabad that we actually quote quite a bit, except that we just quote the first two lines to describe the process of creation. And all of you are familiar with it, so I'm not going to read it. It turns out it's a beautiful explanation of this creative process. Arbad Narbad Tandukara, Taranna Gagna Hukam Apara. All of you sort of know about this. So what I tried to do was illustrate this Shabad from left to right. So at the extreme left is what I call the absolute or the ultimate reality being an idea in its own mind, what we call ad such. This is really before anything. Also referred to as sun samad, where all of the potentiality is sort of hidden, is latent. It's not manifest, it's not created. And that's what Guruji is saying, Arbad Narbad Tundukara, that it was all darkness. And there was nothing, in other words. So that's where the whole process begins. And then the very interesting thing is, one might ask, well, why on earth did it all start? And several lines down in this Shabad, Guruji tells us that Jatis Pana Ta Jagat Upaya. He had the intention, or you could say in poetic language, desire, a wish. But let's stick with intent. So he had the intent, and that intent then changed into will. So you will see the green line starting from Ekunkar. Ekunkar becomes the creator after, it starts the manifestation process with Pana. And then Pana, Ekunkar wills itself into Hukam. And I have tried to show Hukam at the very outset and then linearly describe Naam, Shabad, and Guru. And then there is a bit of a discontinuity, and then Haume. So the point I'm trying to make is that, before there was existence, there was Ad Such. Then the intent arose, and it manifested itself as will, Hukam. And then there was a cataclysmic event, Kita Pasao Eko Kawao. And this Hukam then divided itself into existence and non-existence, Nirgun and Sirgun. And the result is that was endless cause and effect that we see. Space and time comes into existence, and two very charged states come into existence, Nam and Haume. So the thing to remember is that in this existence, at least the way I see it, there is polarity. Things kind of mutually arise together. So, opposites seem to arise together. So here I've used some lingo from the discipline that I'm familiar with, which is technology, software development. And I was thinking to myself, if I had to explain this to somebody who was not familiar with Gurmat or knew nothing about Sikhi, you could think about Hukam as being the planning stage, the Naam and Shabad as being the build stage, where you build the software, the design and the construct, Shabad being the sort of constructive, creative agency, and Naam I kind of think of as being the design. And Guru being the sort of delivery mechanism, this is like the manual that you give out to the users, and we being the users. And so the Guru then becomes the person, the thing, or the force that we connect with first. So I just wanted to share this with you very quickly, and show you how I kind of conceive in my mind as to how this process works. So if this is how the process works, then it follows that if concur had the intent, then it follows that we are instruments of that concur, and we should also then, in our personal experiences and lives, try to further this end. That becomes our goal. So, Arvinda, can you go to the next slide, which says Hukam, the quantum mind?
And we are good.
Right. Okay. So just a little bit on what I understand the quantum sort of to mean. So quantum physics has told us that we've reached the limits, of dividing matter. We can go no further. And now we are suddenly in an area where all of the rules that apply to the material world don't quite apply. Cause and effect, for example. So in very briefly, what it's saying is that the world of quanta, this quantum world, as opposed to the material world, which is entangled in cause and effect, there is actually infinite possibilities within our experiential data stream, infinite. And we tend to select a specific reality based on our experience, learning, and expectations, our imagination, in other words. So we tend to choose from these impulses what we expect, what is familiar to us, and what is comfortable. So since nobody has the same imagination, we always tend to pick something different. So we see reality a little different. I mean, an example that I read about was watching a movie and people coming out seeing different things, although they saw the same movie. And then there is an example here of how to think of the quantum mind as having two dimensions to it: the empirical mind that we are very familiar with, and the quantum mind, which is really the hidden mind, so to speak, or the unconscious mind. Now, the problem is, now in Gurbani too, I think it has been said on this forum that the unconscious is more, what we think the unconscious is more relevant, is more important, and more meaningful than what we consider the conscious mind, the physical mind. So with that, think of the quantum mind as having these two properties. And what I read somewhere, I can't attest to this, but it kind of makes my point, is that at any given moment, the unconscious mind is receiving close to 11 million bits per second from the senses of data. Of this 11 million, only 126 bits per second of potential information is passed on to the conscious mind for processing. That's like 0.00001 dot 0.0000122 of your potential. So this small, and then here's an interesting thing. What they say is, what happens is this small subset of data, because you tend to pick it based on what you expect, what is familiar, what is comfortable, over time becomes that small subset of data that you habitually pull from. This becomes your home, because it'll just go back to what is familiar, what is expected, what is comfortable, and ignore all of those 11 billion bits. So what Gurbani is telling us is that we need to find a way to bring these together in a working perspective. So because we are always acting with both minds, except that we are not conscious of the so-called unconscious mind. Now, how may interact with physical reality? Through the senses. It processes analytically, and then it uses language to achieve the stability of logic. That is what we rely on. So this is pretty much like a machine function, whereas Hukam works, the quantum mind, if you will, works on the physical plane as well, but it also focuses on non-physical reality. which is experienced with a second set of senses that include intuition, instinct, sehaj. There is this pankti in Gurbani, "Akho akhi bajo vekhna," where the pointer is that there is another set of faculties that you need in order to see Hukam, because Hukam is not processed logically, but it is processed in a more open-ended fashion, and it does not use the language of words. It uses the language of patterns to achieve insight into things. So Guru Nanak is basically telling us that we need to bring the two states of our minds together, because working on the physical plane, unfortunately, becomes much more gratifying to us, much more fulfilling. But here is the paradox, is what Gurbani is telling us, that focusing on the physical plane itself has less meaning. It is working in the non-physical plane, and this is what we know Nam and Sabad and so on to be to, actually is more aligned with Hukam and has a more powerful impact on what we can do, even with our physical reality. So the deeper that our work in this dimension of the mind is, the more impactful we will be in our lives. So the way I understand this is, what is going on in the real world is, and Guru Nanak's invite to us, or at least his injunction to us, is that ik, which is a unity, is a collaborative, cooperative world consciousness. And we are like part of a large network, our brains, which have to come together so that we can push forward this intent, this pana. The pana is essentially to bring the entire universe into some state of consciousness. So that, to me, is kind of how I conceive Hukam. And I had promised you that I was not going to rely too much on direct Gurmat Pantis, although I hope that this will stand the test of Gurbani, because that is where most of my sort of ideas have come from. So with that said, let's go on to the next slide here very quickly. This is, obviously, you've seen this before, and I just like to use this over and over again. On the left is Haume, which is currently operating on the physical plane, which is Tat. It needs to start turning inwards and also activate live. And that can only happen if you birth a Jigyasa, and Vismad, I should have added, because Vismad is what Guru Nanak is talking about when he talks about this in his Shabad. He goes, watching all of this, I've just gone into Vismad, which is awe and wonderment. And that is how you, and then the technology is pretty straightforward. Sonia Mane, attention, active, dynamic attention, to be able to grab the signals that are coming to you through Hukam, which, as I said, are not physical. And then moving upwards is where you begin to institutionalize all of this. The individual who walks through this little bottom here will become inspired. Nanak hukme je bujhe, taha mein kahe na koi. I think we tend to stress understanding of Hukam more than Haume here in this pankti. I would turn it around and I would say, look, if you can focus on just shattering the illusion of your Haume, you will understand what Hukam is. That is the illusion that you have to really shatter. Hukmi kahe na jaye again implies that it is not a physical saying, obviously. So your Haume is in the way because it's operating on the physical plane. Just get out of your way and you will begin to understand Hukam. And then you can just sort of see on the left some of the qualities that we need to really develop in ourselves. So in the interest of time, I am now at the last slide here. And these are some of the implications that are floating around in my head. And I will assure you that I haven't quite figured it all out yet, but I am placing in front of you how I'm thinking about Hukam. The first thing is we read off and on, Jaisi mein aave khasam ki bani taisra kari gyan mein lalo. From there, it seems like Gurbani is Hukam itself. This is perhaps the first step of our getting engaged with Hukam, because it is in a form that we can actually understand even with our Haume. So it seems to me that Gurbani is Hukam. It is being expressed in a way that we can even engage with it, even with our Haume. The idea is that as we engage with Gurbani and do jap, which is contemplation, reflection over and over again, that we will begin to understand what an illusion our Haume is and how it's getting in the way. And I suppose all of us are doing this here collectively off and on. Now, that has implications also for, a discussion that often comes up here is, okay, so if everything is hukam, then what about my free will? What happens to my karam? I'm supposed to be acting here. I think we need to think very carefully about this, because Dilpreet and I have talked about this, and I said to him, I don't think there is a free will, but you have free choices. You may have choices within the framework of hukam, and perhaps the key is, how do I figure out what is aligning with hukam? Because at the end of the day, you remember the presentation that Rana Virji gave us. Every thought is coming from hukam, because he posed that question. Where are these thoughts coming from? We haven't a clue where they're coming from. We are just processing, as I told you, a very small subset of this thought. So we may not have free will, but we may have free choice. And the second thing is that, we had a discussion some years ago about the philosophy of karma and hukam. And, Peshora Singh, who some of you might know, Professor Peshora Singh, he was part of the blog at the time. This was some years ago. And, he made a point that has stuck with me ever since. He said, look, there is a difference, because what he said was that, in Sikh doctrine, karam is not inexorable. It's not absolute. In Indian religions, it is. But in Gurmat, karam is subject to hukam. So therefore, karam is not an impersonal law, but a principle that can be overridden in the name of justice. So another can override your karmic balance. So, and it makes sense, right? Because we come across many times where Guruji is very clearly saying, Tu karta se char menda sai. You are the one who's actually doing this. So to imagine that we are doing stuff might actually be, I suppose, a bit of an illusion again, right? So that's the other thing that I hope we can talk about. And acceptance of this will doesn't mean that you are going to be complacent, because that leads me to my third point, the socially active renunciate. The title of a book that I have here sitting somewhere, I didn't think much of the book, but the title caught my attention. I think that is really Guru Nanak's blueprint of an ideal society, that you are in Chardi Kala, you have Chao inspired, you're inspired to actually work with Hukam, because then suddenly it is a very large project, and that should inspire all of us to plunge right into it and forget about ignoring this universal symphony and trying to play our own little cacophony on the side. So that, in sum, is my thoughts on Hukam. Thank you very much. Harvinder, yours for the first round.
Anji, thank you, Virji. Very nice. Anji, Riputam Virji, any question or observation? Riputam Virji? Dilpreet Virji?
Anji, first of all, thank you to Ravinder Virji for such a eye-opening conversation. I'm still thinking about a lot of things. So, Virji, first observation was, I liked your analogy on the second slide where you were comparing the planning phase and then the implement design, and then there is a run phase here.
Yeah.
So run phase is there. So I was just thinking that is this also iterative kind of thing, that we go into run and then we continue doing these things? It is not linear kind of thing.
That's a good observation. And I would say, actually, if you look at the little circle that I have drawn at the bottom of this enclosed space, if you can see that little circle.
Okay, yes.
It says non-linear, because
Oh.
I have shown time here at the bottom, akal and kal, in a linear way. But in the Indian context, it seems we think of time as being non-linear. So, you know, the 4 jugs that we talk about are all on this circumference of this cyclical time. So yes, I mean, you know, my thought is like yours, that this is cyclical and it's iterative, because Gurbani also says, you know, that this process has happened many, many times.
Okay, no, good. And then the other thing, if you can explain a little bit more on, I didn't get it completely, that in the next slide on the quantum mind, you said working on the non-physical plane. If you can elaborate a little bit on that.
So, you know, reality as we see it is physical to us, right? What is immediately in front of us, matter or Maya. So that's what we see. However, we know for a fact that what supports this matter, the structure that is being supported, is not something that you can see with your eyes. There is an unseen dimension of reality. And that is what I call quantum, although I call the whole thing quantum, but that is what I refer to as quantum, or that is what I also think of as Naam. Because, you know, the design is not physical. It's there. It's supporting Naam ke dare. You know, so the underlying creativity and intelligence is not visible to us. Just like when you build a table or build software, you just see the operation of the software. You don't really see the object code, because that is in machine language.
Okay, no, that's good.
So that's how kind of it seems to me that Naam and Shabad operate, and your tie-in into that unseen world starters is Gurbani, because that it is kind of the one that traverses both the unseen and the seen, the Guru.
Okay, and the last point, right? Just you said that we get around 11 million, or that number of.
Yeah, that's not my number. I just picked it up from somewhere.
And
11 million bits per second are actually delivered to our through our senses. Okay, and that the unconscious mind, where they first hit, passes on only 126 bits per second, which is, you know, practically nothing.
So is that the capacity, or we are not focused, or what causes this big drop? I don't know if you know this or not. That what is the
I can only venture a guess, because if you remember, what they're saying is what you react to basically is what you expect, what is familiar, and this becomes that cycle that develops into harmony. You begin to carve out a small identity out of doing the same thing over and over again. And this is, you know, what Guru Nanak means by awo jao, you know, because you're constantly sort of taking this input, processing it in a very narrow way. Then the same thing happens, and then suddenly it builds these neural sort of pathways in your head, and encloses, which we call hukam, right? Your conditioned self. So you're not really exploiting your full potential, really, is the message.
Okay. Thank you, Virji.
Thank you.
Thank you, Virji. Eileen?
Wow, there's so much to think about. I just thinking, yeah, by kind of having a lot of brain explosions here.
I can hear them.
In a good way.
Yes.
I think, but I think one of the things that really stood out and resonated a lot with me was, you know, just the point you were just describing about the sensory experience that we have, being much greater than our awareness. And maybe two observations. Well, one observation, one question. So the observation is it kind of resonates with me when I think about, behavioral biases, like behavioral finance and things like that, where you just observe these patterns of people having a perception that's very, very different than reality, right? So you might perceive things a certain way, and you have a kind of a bias toward looking at it that way. Your memories or events that happen, and it might be really, you could sort of logically prove or film them to show, well, that's not really what happened, right? So that's a good way in for me to think about this difference. And then the question, I guess, really is, do you think it's aligned with your view on Hukam to think about Hukam just even more broadly as could you describe Hukam as just the nature of life itself? I mean, is the Hukam just the sort of the core essence of life that permeates everything? That this order, so we're all sort of trying to get somehow more aligned to the fundamental essence of life itself.
That would be quite a good way to sum up how I feel. I do believe that Hukam perhaps is the sort of the one unified will that in turn manifests itself in various ways, like Naam, sometimes like Shabad or Guru. But it's almost an analogy that I can think of as, water being steam or ice, but still being water. So Hukam being Naam or being Shabad or being Guru or even being Haume as far as I'm concerned. I think the reason I drew it linearly, Eileen, was because it occurs to me that if one were to examine the nature of this Hukam, that Aristotelian sort of markers, one of them is teleological, that this substance or this thing actually has a teleology, which means it actually has a direction. Because there is a will involved, it would not be too far-fetched to say that there is a desire and the desire has a direction. There is an outcome that is being desired, right? So I, of course, within my Haume sort of laden mind can think of this as that there is a and that is the outcome that we should all work towards making happen. You see, so when we are not working towards that end, then we are not in Hukam, we are in Haume.
But I guess
does that make sense?
The only part I'm not clear on, it does make sense, but the only part I'm not clear on is that a direction? I mean, is it a moral intent or an ordering of things for a purpose, or is it? I mean, when you think about sort of water and steam and land and some these sort of the laws of nature, right? Those seem to be somewhat objective and not toward a certain end.
Well, my thought is that if Hukam basically circumscribes everything and that there's nothing outside of Hukam, it follows then that it also is the moral law. It is not just the physical law, right? I mean, that's the point of saying that it is everything. That's why it creates us, it runs the world, it's everywhere. So it is also moral. However, I do think of it as being what Gurbani calls a play, where it wants all of us to collaborate. And the end of the play is, a fully conscious universe. And then maybe the process begins again. It may not be the kind of purpose that you and I have, in our little narrow spaces, but it could be this vast sort of delight that he's having out of doing this. They use the word Chao quite a lot for the creator. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's how to think about it.
No, I think that does. That helps a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Ji. And Gurdeep Uncle, Montreal.
It's very interesting the way he explained Ravindra-ji. He did very, very good efforts. Technically, it looks good. But I have two lines from Gurbani. where it says Hukum na bujje khasam ka soi nar kacha. That means we have to bujjan wali koi bujarat hai jehdi insaan nu, which we have to find out what is that bujarat. The second way, Gurbani says, apne bhane jo challe bhai vichhad chotan khave. So I think the whole process, but Ravinder Vij explained very nicely. Apne bhane we have to go and we have to find out that hukam, and then we have to tune ourselves with that hukam. But rest of the world, all the whole creature except a human being, they're all in tune with that hukam because they can't do anything by themselves. They don't have that much wisdom which man has. That's why he explains so well to us. But only problem, he mentioned also anyway, I have nothing much comments on that, which is home. That's a wall, that's a hindrance in between, and how to cross over that the wall of a home to understand the hukam. So I am okay, I'm convinced with the Vindaviji, even I have to explore more about it, but he gave us very good tips. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If he can enlighten on me a little bit on this, Hukmana Bujje Khazam ka soi nar kacha, apne paane jo chale pai bichho chote khame, what he thinks about this, in context to everything what he explained. Thank you.
Thank you, Ji.
Concur ji.
Ravinder Singh ji, I just totally loved this presentation.
Thank you.
And I loved your drawings with all the Gurmukhi, and it's great.
Thanks.
You know, something you said, that the thing about the 11 million bits reminded me of something that the Sri Singh Sahib Yogi Bhajan talked about. And what he talked about the unconscious mind, the subconscious mind, and the conscious mind. And he tried to give a sense of the vastness, that the unconscious mind, he said, was 26 billion light miles big. That's the unconscious mind. And then the subconscious mind was 8 million miles squared, you know, so 8 million miles deep, long, and high. And he was saying, I think he was relating it to this idea of actually what we perceive, like our capacity to perceive on a soul level is infinite almost. And our subconscious has this vast ability to store things. And then he said the conscious mind was 9 seconds.
If that.
And that was the ratio, is that we live as human beings consciously every 9 seconds. And that if we don't develop our intuition, you know, that you've got to be intuitive constantly if you want to really fully experience being a human. And so when you were making this presentation, I was remembering that he talked about that as well. And I think this is really, you know, like the quantum mind, it's like the soul has an identity, which is Nam, and then the mind has an identity, which is Hauman. And can you get the mind to shift to identify with the true spirit, the true light? Because in that light, perception and decision-making becomes just a very different experience. And when the perception and the way you make decisions changes, you get out of action and reaction and you get into Sahaj and Santok. And it's just about like, well, do you want to be peaceful and happy in life or not? And in that sense, you know, Hukam doesn't seem to me to be will. It seems to me to be about the way things are, the way things work, what it is versus what we imagine or want it to be. Anyway, I don't have any questions. I just wanted to share those thoughts, and I'm happy to hear anything you have to say, but I just really enjoyed your presentation.
No, thank you. I appreciate your observations. And you know, Gurbani has a lot of terms that I have deliberately stayed away from for this presentation. You know, we here as a group have actually spent quite a bit of time on, you know, man, buddha, chit, har, and some of these terms apply to the quantum mind. I mean, you know, har being your higher self. So, but I tried to, because what I'd said the last time was, I want to be able to talk about this as though I was talking to someone who really doesn't knows anything about Sikhi. So, but thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Thank you. And Chetanjit.
Hi Virji, thank you so much for great presentation. It definitely stretched my mind, and I learned a lot. I have two questions that I want to ask. So the first question is, as you said in the first slide, right? The foundational question is walk in Hukam and way of living that is worthy of living. So the first question I have is like, can you touch on like what would be some of the parameters or hints or indications from my daily life that I can use to judge myself, that am I living in Hukam for myself, not to judge others, but what could be those parameters or indications that I can use daily to see if I am living in Hukam?
So I will answer that in a couple of ways. One is that the very act of wanting to discern with your Haume based mat whether or not you're living in Haume kind of in some ways defeats the purpose, and that's where we are all pretty stuck. Okay, because we are so accustomed to doing something cause and effect, right? We're always looking for an effect, and that defeats the very purpose because we are still acting out of Haume. So I would say that the very idea of trying to consciously look and say, hey, I did this, is that in Hukam or not, I think kind of is counterproductive. The second thing I would say to you is I remember a remark that Dr. Suzuki, musical man, was also a doctor, who supposedly achieved enlightenment. And someone asked me, and this is a Zen story, enlightened masters, and the enlightened master was asked, well, now that you're enlightened, what's the difference? And his response was, well, I used to chop wood before enlightenment, and I'm chopping wood after enlightenment. The only difference is that I feel as though I'm 1 inch off the ground. So if anything, if you're starting to feel that you're elevating with inspiration, perhaps you're in the right direction. But as I said earlier, don't be looking, because in that looking, you're defeating the very fun. Okay, so I don't know if this makes sense to you or not, but as I said earlier, our first step is to connect with Guru Granth Sahib as Gurbani and begin to chew on it. And you will find, and I base this on my own experience, you will find that over time, things will just start to happen and you won't even know when they happened. Things will just happen. So my suggestion would be that is what we should do, is engage with Gurbani seriously, reflectively, contemplatively, and then leave the rest to Hukam or Raja rather, which is a associated term, which is his pleasure. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, I don't think I answered your question.
Some part of it does. Thanks for that. The second question that I have, and I have actually grappled with this question in the past, like I keep thinking about like what is the goal for humanity, and I think you touched this in your presentation when you said we need to further this end, or that actually becomes our goal or divine desire. So can you elaborate on that? Like what is?
Yeah, I think that's very simple. I mean, furthering the goal simply means, okay, so I'm just 9 seconds, right? As Concur said. She also talked about being intuitive. In one sentence, I would say to you that the goal for us is to extend our consciousness to include the unconscious or subconscious dimensions of our mind, which is Naam. So if I were to say to you in Gurbani, Toks or Panktis, it is Naam nal jodna. Okay? Guru nal pehlo judo, Guru Naam nal, Gyan milega tanu. Naam means Gyan, basically. It's knowledge. So that is our goal. Very simple.
ठीक है वीर जी, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ji. Meena Ben Ji. Meena Panji there? Gurjeet Veer ji?
हाँ जी वीर जी वाहिगुरू जी का खालसा वाहिगुरू जी की फतेह. It was a very nice presentation, so thank you very much, Ravinder Veerji.
Thank you, Veerji.
The main, I'll just put one question, that what was the need of the Hukam, and then I think even last time, whose Hukam it is? So what is your understanding about this, that what was the need for the Hukam, and then whose Hukam is it?
Well, I can attempt an answer. The Hukam is of what was at one point Ad Sach, who became a concur. And as the quote I read out, which I understand to say, Jatis Pana Ta Jagat Upaya. So Ude Pane, which Pana Hoya Pana simply means, there was an intent, a desire. And from there, whatever this it is, willed itself into existence, which we refer to as Hukam.
And whose Hukam is it?
I think I said it's the Ad Sach that becomes a concur.
So you indicated a bit that, to me, looks like you were saying something about macro. Do you mean this is at a macro level? Because
I
you
don't
did
know. I don't know what
you
macro
have
means
indicated. You have indicated.
If you were to think in terms of my limited understanding of physics and science, I think it's referring to a singularity. When it says there's nothing, that there is a singularity, then with a big bang becomes dispersed. So at the beginning, it is just almost non-existent. There's no physicality. It is what it is. Hukam is. Who, I don't know if that is a question that we can ever answer who it is. We've given it many different sort of names.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Veerji. Anji, Riputam Veerji, are you back?
Oh yeah, I've been here. Maybe the sound might have cut off. Yeah. So actually, I have a question related to this only. I'm sorry, my dog for some reason is.
I think he has probably the more important question.
All right. So the question I have maybe is related to the subconscious or unconscious mind that you were hinting on, and then the conscious mind. So the way I understood it was that you're saying that in the subconscious mind there are all of these potentialities, so to speak, infinite possibilities. And then ultimately what comes into the conscious mind is one state, one choice, right?
Yes. That's my understanding. That's how I've understood what quantum mechanics is talking about. So Werner Heisenberg saying, that nature exposes to, the observer effect, what he calls the observer effect. What he's saying is that you're creating your reality because it depends on what the observer is looking for. And that, I think, it collapses into one outcome. Yes.
So that wave function is a probability wave function, and there are
outcomes
I can't
are
discuss
too much
probabilistic.
Wave functions. You got to put it in simple. I really don't know what a wave function.
What I mean to say is that there are various probabilistic outcomes. Some are more likely stages, and the other are almost not likely to happen, but they can. So is there that element of chance here that you are hinting from your subconscious to conscious mind, or is it a very deliberate choice that happens? Essentially, that was the question.
I don't know the answer to that because I have not yet traversed across, but I tend to think this is thinking. My thought is,
Lost you guys again.
my thought is that even though the possibilities are immense, there has to be some randomness in effect as well. I think at bottom, there has to be some randomness because, you couldn't possibly predict the outcomes all the time. Sometimes you could, sometimes you couldn't. Perhaps when you start touching your the potentialities, that you have a better probability. But I personally tend to feel that at bottom that there is a certain element of randomness that can always happen.
Okay, Vijay. Yeah. So there is a maybe then could you also comment on the difference between a will and a choice, free will and choice? In my mind, the two were the same, and I'm not
Well,
sure.
I haven't really thought this through. I'm still thinking about it, but I will say that I make the distinction based on my current thinking. Having a will assumes that you're a free agent, that you have agency. I think what Guru Nanak is saying is that you have no such thing. But for all the choices that are being presented to you through your unconscious, you have the choice to pick one. And that if you associate with Naam and Shabad and so on, you begin to actually expand your consciousness and therefore your potential. But you're not an autonomous agent. That's what I mean by will.
Okay.
You can't act outside of Hukam, is what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you wanted to, you can't.
Okay. So that means free will is in a very abstract sense, free will, which basically means if I jump, I should not come down. That kind of an autonomous agency is not.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravindra, for wonderful presentation. So you can wrap up last words.
Well, we are past 3 o'clock. I enjoyed doing the presentation. I am of the conviction that we should more and more begin to use the Shabdavali that is available to us today around us. And then perhaps we can